Keys to Warfare. The power of guerrilla warfare is essentially psychological. In conventional warfare, everything converges on the engagement of two armies in battle. That is what all strategy is devised for, and what the martial instinct requires as a kind of release from tension. By postponing this natural convergence indefinitely, the guerrilla strategist creates intense frustration. The longer this mental corrosion continues, the more debilitating it gets. Napoleon lost to the Russians because his strategic bearings were pushed off course. His mind fell before his army did. Because it is so psychological, guerrilla strategy is infinitely applicable to social conflict. In life, as in war, our thoughts and emotions naturally converge on moments of contact and engagement with others. We find people who are deliberately elusive, who evade contact, extremely disconcerting. Whether because we want to grab them and pin them down, or because we are so annoyed with them that we want to hit them, they pull us toward them, so that either way, the elusive one controls the dynamic. Some people take this further, attacking us in ways that are evasive and unpredictable. These opponents can gain a disturbing power over our minds, and the longer they keep it up, the more we are sucked into fighting on their terms. With advances in technology that make it easier to maintain a vaporous presence, and the use of the media as both a screen and a kind of guerrilla adjunct, the power and effectiveness of this warfare in political or social battle are greatly enhanced. The primary consideration should always be whether a guerrilla-style campaign is appropriate for the circumstances you are facing. It is especially effective, for instance, against an opponent who is aggressive yet clever, a man like Napoleon. These types cannot stand lack of contact with an enemy. They like to maneuver, outwit, and out-hit. Having nothing to strike at neutralizes their cleverness, and their aggression becomes their downfall. This strategy of the void works wonders on those who are used to conventional warfare. Lack of contact is so outside their experience that it warps any strategic powers they have. Once you have determined that a guerrilla war is appropriate, take a look at the army you will use. A large conventional army is never suitable. Fluidity and the ability to strike from many angles are what counts. The organizational model is the cell, a relatively small group of men and women, tight-knit, dedicated, self-motivated, and spread out. These cells should penetrate the enemy camp itself. In most conflicts, time is a danger, bringing Murphy's Law into play. If anything can go wrong, it will. If your army is small and relatively self-sufficient, though, there is less to go wrong. And meanwhile, you are working to make sure that for the enemy, the passage of time is a nightmare. Morale is sinking, resources are stretched, and even great planners like Napoleon are finding themselves with problems they could never have foreseen. The effect is exponential. As unexpected problems crop up, the enemy starts making mistakes, which lead to more problems, and so it goes. Make time an offensive weapon in your strategizing. Design your maneuvers to keep your enemies just barely going, always thinking that one more battle will do the trick. You want them to deteriorate slowly. A sudden sharp setback, a clear view of the trap you are laying for them, and they will pull out before the damage is done. Let them take key positions that give them the illusion of success. They will hold on to them tenaciously as your raids and pin-prick attacks grow in number. Then, as they weaken, increase the pace of these attacks. Let them hope, let them think it is all still worth it until the trap is set. Then, break their illusion. Just as you are extending time, contrary to convention, you are also extending space. You want to bring the fight to areas outside the theater of war, to include public and international opinion, turning the war into a political and global issue and giving the enemy too large a space to defend. Political support is invaluable to an underdog guerrilla campaign. The longer the fight is drawn out, the more the enemy seems morally unjustified and politically isolated. Always try to ally your guerrilla campaign with a cause you can defend as just and worthy. The essence of guerrilla warfare is fluidity. The enemy will always try to adjust to what you are doing, attempting to find its feet in this unfamiliar terrain. You must be prepared to change and adopt whatever is contrary to expectation. This might mean occasionally fighting in a conventional manner, concentrating your army to attack here or there, then dispersing again. Your goal is maximum disorder and unfamiliarity. Remember, this war is psychological. It is more on the level of strategy than anything else that you give the enemy nothing to hold on to, nothing tangible to counter. It is the enemy's minds that are grasping at air, and their minds that fall first. Reversal. A guerrilla strategy is extremely hard to counter, which is what makes it so effective. If you find yourself in a fight with guerrillas, and you use conventional methods to fight them, you play into their hands. Winning battles and taking territory means nothing in this kind of war. You need a quick, decisive victory over such an opponent. If this seems impossible, it is better to pull out while you can than to sink into the protracted war the guerrilla fighter is trying to lure you into. 27. Seem to work for the interests of others while furthering your own. The alliance strategy. The best way to advance your cause with the minimum of effort and bloodshed is to create a constantly shifting network of alliances, getting others to compensate for your deficiencies, do your dirty work, fight your wars, spend energy pulling you forward. The art is in choosing those allies who fit the needs of the moment and fill the gaps in your power. Give them gifts, offer them friendship, help them in time of need, all to blind them to reality and put them under subtle obligation to you. At the same time, work to sow dissension in the alliances of others, weakening your enemies by isolating them, while forming convenient coalitions. Keep yourself free of negative entanglements. The perfect ally. In 1467, Charles, the 34-year-old Count of Charleroi, received the news he had secretly longed for. His father, the Duke of Burgundy, known as Philip the Good, had died, making Charles the new duke. Father and son had clashed over the years. Philip was patient and practical, and during his reign had slowly managed to expand Burgundy's already impressive holdings. Charles was more ambitious and more warlike. The empire he inherited was immense, including Flanders, Holland, Zeeland, and Luxembourg to the north of present-day France, and the important Duchy of Burgundy itself in northeastern France. Now, as Duke, Charles had the power and resources at his command to realize his dreams of conquest into Germany and beyond. Two obstacles stood in his path. The first was the independent Swiss cantons to Burgundy's east. Charles would have to incorporate this territory by force before moving into southern Germany. The Swiss were fierce warriors who would not take kindly to any invasion. But in the end, they could hardly match the size and power of the Duke's army. The second obstacle was King Louis XI of France, Charles's cousin and arch-rival since childhood. France then was still a feudal state, composed of several duchies like Burgundy, whose dukes owed allegiance to the king. But these duchies were, in fact, independent powers, and could form their own league if the king dared provoke them. Burgundy was the most powerful duchy of them all, and everyone knew Louis dreamed of swallowing it up and making France a united power. Charles, however, felt confident that he could best his older cousin in both diplomacy and warfare. After all, Louis was weak, even a little soft in the head. How else to explain his strange infatuation with the Swiss cantons? Almost from the beginning of his reign, Louis had courted them assiduously, treating them almost like equals to France. There were many more powerful states he could have allied himself with to increase France's power, but he seemed obsessed with the Swiss. Perhaps he felt an affinity to their simple lifestyle. For a king, he himself had rather peasant tastes. Louis also had an aversion toward warfare, preferring to buy peace, even at a high price, than to fund an army. It was imperative that Charles strike now, before Louis wised up and started acting more like a king. Charles formed a plan to realize his ambitions, and then some. He would first move into Alsace, between France and Germany, and swallow up the weak kingdoms in the area. Then he would form an alliance with the great warrior king of England, Edward IV, whom he would persuade to land a large army at Calais. His own army would link up with the English at Reims in central France, where Edward would be crowned the country's new king. The Duke and Edward would easily dispose of Louis's weak army. The Duke could then march east across the Swiss cantons, while Edward would march south. Together, they would form the dominant power in Europe. By 1474, everything was in place. Edward had signed on to the plan. The Duke began by marching on the Upper Rhine, but just as he began his maneuvers, he learned that a large Swiss army had invaded his home territory of Burgundy. This army was funded by Louis XI himself. By this action, Louis and the Swiss were clearly sending a warning to the Duke that they would not look kindly on any future invasion of the cantons. But Charles had enough forces in Burgundy to drive the Swiss out. He was not a man to provoke in such a way. Both parties would more than pay for their rash invasion. In the summer of 1475, the English army, the largest yet assembled for an invasion of France, landed at Calais under the personal leadership of Edward IV. Charles went to meet Edward to finalize their plans and toast their imminent conquests. He then quickly returned to his own troops, which were marching south through Lorraine in preparation for the great link-up with the English forces at Reims. Suddenly, some disturbing news reached Charles in the field. His spies at the French court reported that Louis had opened up secret negotiations with Edward. Apparently, Louis had persuaded the English king that Charles was using him and could not be trusted. Knowing that England's finances were weak, Louis had offered generous terms of peace, amounting to a large annual pension paid directly to the king and his court. He had entertained the English with great feasts of food and ale, and then, to the Duke's utter disgust and amazement, Edward fell for it, signed the treaty, and took his forces home. The Duke had barely had time to get over this bitter news when Louis suddenly sent him envoys to broker a long-term truce between France and Burgundy. This was typical of the king. Everything he did was inconsistent and contradictory. What was he thinking? Signing the truce would mean the Duke could now confidently march against the Swiss, knowing that France would not interfere. Perhaps the king was guided by his great fear of war. Charles happily approved the truce. The Swiss were outraged. Louis had been their friend, and now, at the moment of imminent peril, he had abandoned them. But the Swiss were used to fighting on their own. They would simply have to mobilize every man available. In the dead of the winter of 1477, the Duke, impatient for victory, crossed the Jura Mountains heading east. The Swiss were waiting for him near the town of Granson. This was the first time the Duke had done battle with the Swiss, and he was caught off guard by what confronted him. It began with the alarming bellow of Swiss battle horns, which echoed in the mountains, creating a frightening din. Next, thousands of Swiss soldiers advanced down the slope toward the Burgundians. They marched with perfect precision, packed tight in phalanxes from which their enormous pikes stuck out like the spines of a giant hedgehog in motion. Their flanks and rear were protected by halberdiers swinging spiked battle-axes. It was a terrifying sight. The Duke ordered attack after attack with his cavalry to break up the phalanxes, only to watch them being slaughtered. His artillery was hard to maneuver in the mountainous terrain. The Swiss fought with incredible fierceness, and their phalanxes were impenetrable. A reserve Swiss force, hidden in the woods on the Burgundian right, suddenly emerged and attacked. The Duke's army fell into a headlong retreat. The battle ended in a slaughter, from which the Duke, however, escaped. A few months later, it was the turn of the Swiss to go on the offensive by marching into Lorraine. In January 1478, the Duke counterattacked with his now enfeebled forces. Again, the Burgundians were routed, and this time the Duke did not escape. His body was finally identified on the field of battle, his head cloven in two by a Swiss halberd, his body pierced by pikes. In the months after Charles' death, Louis XI swallowed up Burgundy, eliminating the last great feudal threat to a unified France. The Duke had unknowingly fallen prey to Louis's elaborate plan to destroy him without wasting a single French soldier.